You're listening to Conservation Connection.
Presented by Last Chance Endeavors.
I'm Chance.
I'm Sarah Catherine.
And we are a husband and wife team that runs an environmental education nonprofit focused on connecting students to the environment.
Here on Conservation Connection, we do just that by introducing you to the groundbreaking science and conservation work that's happening every day across the globe.
We talk to professionals in the world of conservation science and the environmental movement, and we ask them about their career,
their current projects,
their wild and crazy stories from the field,
and everything in between.
This episode is brought to you by the Wild and Scenic Film Festival in Nevada City, California.
Wild and Scenic presents environmental and adventure films to illustrate the Earth's beauty,
the challenges that our planet faces,
and the work communities worldwide do to protect our home.
Join us as we discover just how these dedicated people are working to protect our planet.
Let's get to the show.
Alrighty guys, welcome to another episode of Conservation Connection. We are here at the Wild and Scenic Film Festival in Nevada City, and I cannot tell you, I've been trying to make this episode happen all weekend. We are sitting down with Molly Kawahata, who is a climate activist. She was a climate advisor to the Obama administration in the White House. She's also a subject of the film, The Scale of Hope. So we are just so excited to have you on the show.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive right in. You clearly have a busy schedule here all weekend. Tell us, what is The Scale of Hope about?
Yeah, so it's a film produced by Patagonia, and it's really touching on three things. Because it's Patagonia, ice climbing, and my journey becoming an ice climber and pursuing my dreams of climbing in Alaska. The second aspect is, of course, about climate change. It's a climate film, and it's getting at kind of this framework I've been developing over the years and trying to reframe the climate narrative. And the third is about my journey with mental health and living with the mental illness of bipolar II disorder and the ways in which that has shaped my life in both helpful ways and painful ways.
One of the things about podcasting at film festivals is that I don't always get to see the films of the people that we're interviewing before we interview them, but we were fortunate enough to watch the whole hour and 6 minutes of it the other day. And I just have to say, I'm really glad that the story was not ice climbers are sad that ice is going away because the climate is changing, because that story's been told 1,000 times. And it was a completely new take, or might I say new framing, of kind of this story. And I would love to hear, I've heard you say this a couple of times throughout the weekend, I'd love to hear your take on framing the climate narrative and what is effective.
Yeah, so that was a big part of this, is that, we didn't want to make a film that was about, the ice climber goes to the mountain and sees the glacier melting and comes back and says, we have to act on climate because I saw the glacier melting. And it's like, one, scientists are way better at that narrative than me. And two, it's so problematic, that narrative. It's incredibly privileged. It's very out of touch. One of the things is that Patagonia wanted to make a film about alpinism and climate change because, that's a world they know very well on both ends. And so there was this conversation about how to portray ice climbing, and ultimately the director Josh Bones Murphy decided to portray my climb of the Alaskan mountains as really a metaphor beyond sort of a literal take on climate, that it was really a metaphor for going after things that feel impossible, but doing them anyway.
So I kind of want to talk about your background a little. What was kind of like your journey like as a child? Did you always find climbing interesting? Just what led you to where you are today? I mean, even being with the Obama administration, like, you have had quite an eventful life.
Kind of a weird journey, like the weirdest life journey. So, so I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, and basically always dreamed of climbing. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I liked hiking, and I always had this sort of extreme personality where I always wanted to do things to the extreme. I liked hiking, but I wanted to do mountaineering because I was sick of, backpacking routes going around the mountains, and I wanted to go up them, but I knew you needed...
Just straight up.
Yeah. And I knew you needed ropes and all this colorful gear people wore that I heard they were climbers, and I had no idea what any of it was for, but I thought it was so cool. And so there's this journey to get into mountaineering. And then once I was in mountaineering, I was like, I'm sick of walking around the glaciers. I want to climb the steep ones. How do you do that? They use their hands. They have these things that look like axes in their hands. How do you do that? And so that became my journey into ice climbing. And so I had this dream for years living in San Francisco. I was living in a city where, you know, rock climbing is the main climbing sport there and has some of the best climbing in the world with Yosemite nearby. But I had dreamt of snow and ice, and that was my real passion. And so I kind of went on this journey of feeling like I was obsessed with Alaska because I had heard at one point that, you know, you always hear about Everest, people climbing Everest, and that's sort of like the mainstream narrative. But I had heard somewhere, and I don't remember where, maybe I read it, that Alaska is where you go to not necessarily climb big mountains, but steep and technical ones.
Wow.
And so there's this perspective in mountaineering, you know, kind of in the mainstream that the most hardcore thing is the bigger the mountain, the higher the elevation. So Everest is the, you know, the culmination of that. But the steep and technical mountains, that's what climbers seek out.
Right. We're talking about the grade, right? Like you can't walk up it. You have to use these picks to pull yourself
literally
up, like almost
climb.
a vertical or sometimes past vertical climb, right?
Yeah, it's like steep mountains. Steep mountains are climbing. That's where you really need to use ropes in new ways. That's where you really need to use more specialized tools, ice tools, which are a more extreme version of an ice axe. They're like curved so that you can really hit into the ice. And I thought it was so cool. And that was like where climbers go. That was in my head. And so I had anxiety for years because I was obsessed with this dream of Alaska climbing. It was the Central Alaska Range. And it's like running in place. Like you want something so bad, you run as fast as you can and you're stuck in place. Because I had this dream and I didn't know how to get there. I knew it was incredibly technical. It was incredibly specialized. And I didn't know how to get those skills and that experience. My breakthrough was starting to spend a ton of time on steep water ice. And in Montana, there's a canyon called Hyalite that's nearby town, nearby Bozeman, which is the most extraordinary place I have ever spent time in. Ever. And it's a canyon where it has really interesting conditions where it's volcanic rock that's kind of low quality, unlike, you know, beautiful Sierra granite in California. And because of that, it seeps water through. It's not nearly as strong as granite. So it seeps water through and also has waterfalls in this area. And because it's Montana, it gets extremely cold conditions, cold enough for this water to freeze vertical formation. And cold enough where you can climb it. And so it's ice climbing is the sport there. And it was this opportunity to go in and develop these skills that I needed. And in that process, it just opened up Alaska for me. And it was the first time I realized I was running at this dream. And so the film, The Scale of Hope, really documents that journey of me becoming an ice climber and then going to Alaska at my first year of really climbing ice, which is a pretty big jump, and in retrospect was maybe not the most responsible decision on my part.
But it came to great things, you know?
Yeah, but it led to, you know, the culmination of climbing an ice climbing route in the Central Alaska Range. And that was the dream. And we didn't get to the top there. And so many things went wrong because of, you know, things that were my responsibility on me and my fault, but was still the greatest experience of my life. And then I returned actually the following year and climbed it with my climbing partner from Montana, and we climbed the route, and I got to see, you know, what that was like much higher up, and it was an extraordinary experience, and we had better conditions and better weather. We weren't climbing in a storm like, you know, you see in the film.
It was really intense. I mean, having watched it, I was like, man, I knew this was going to be an adventure film, but that's adventure right there.
I was like, that looks miserable.
Yeah. You know, it's like spindrift is the term we use for like this loose snow that comes down the mountain. And on ice routes, the routes are so steep and slippery because the ice doesn't have much friction that the snow will clean off. Like if there's a storm, the snow is just coming down. And it's not quite like an avalanche where it like holds and then it releases. It's just a constant flow. It's like a river of snow.
It's like a sandblaster.
Yeah, and it's miserable.
Yeah, it sounds
miserable.
I'm miserable just talking about it.
And it was the most spindrift I've experienced in my entire life. And when you're on lead in ice climbing, the rule is you cannot fall. Unlike other types of climbing, Ice climbing, you are not allowed to fall on lead. And people go, 20 years without ever falling. And so I kind of knew there's this standard and this rule. When spindrift is coming down on you and you're going up and the mountain feels like it's coming down, that's when you kind of start to question, should we be up here? Are these the right conditions? And there's always going to be some of that on routes like these, but it was an intense amount that made me really decide that we needed to turn back. And we did that at 3 a.m.
And then you had to climb down a good chunk of a steep water ice.
Yeah, the rappelling takes forever.
I can't even imagine.
Forever. Yeah.
That's incredible.
So when you got into ice climbing in general, did you realize that your path as like someone who cares about climate activism and climbing, did you realize that those two paths were going to collide in the way that they did?
Yeah, there can be this really literal take on climbing the alpine of like, again, you're encountering the conditions of climate change. Actually, in the places I've climbed, I've experienced that a little bit, but not as much as people who climb in like the Himalaya do. There's definitely, you experience that in Alaska as well, but at the level I'd been climbing before that. So for me, climbing was truly this separate activity. And I really didn't want to be that alpinist that's like, I see climate change, now everybody act on climate. It was really a separate pursuit in my career, and working alongside incredible people who are working on climate action, that was really the focus. We're working on climate action for the sake of people. And that was a different perspective that I was taking than a lot of the outdoor industry was, that like at the end of the day, I don't care if like people can't ice climb anymore, including me. At the end of the day, it's about like cleaning up the air for communities that can't breathe. It's about unleashing technological innovation for society. It's about putting people back to work and creating jobs. That's really what climate action is about. And that's what we have to focus on.
And what for me was really impressive is that there's an obvious way to connect climate and climbing, which we've already discussed a bunch. And then there's this other way to use the climb up the steep water ice as the metaphor for the climb towards a cleaner planet and the sort of commitment, right? And a really adventurous spirit that it takes to summit this climb for climate change, fighting climate change. And that was, I think to me, that was really impressive in terms of like, how are we telling this story? It was a really effective way in my mind to tell that story. It was really cool.
Yeah. And that was the take Josh, the director, did, was like one thing he found between the legs of the stool of the story, which were climate, climbing, and mental health, the overarching theme of all of them was hope. He made me sort of realize that hope was the theme of my life across all domains. It led to my work. It led to my experience living with mental illness, a bipolar II disorder, and it also led to my pursuit in climbing, which is deeply, you have to have a lot of hope because you have to believe you can get to the top even if you don't.
Yeah.
Even if you don't really believe you can get to the top,
yeah.
Which I think I didn't
You have to
really
act like you believe.
Yeah, you just have to like go for it, right. And you have to be okay with the fact that you might not get there. And on so many levels and so many aspects of my life, I don't get there.
Right.
Living with mental illness, I'm not like healed or cured. Like I mess up all the time. But it's about that journey of believing that like, in science, in psychology, they actually say optimism is your belief that the future can be better. But hope is your belief in your agency to change it.
Ooh, I like that.
To be a part of that. And I realize like that's the empowerment frame of it all.
Right, which is critical as we're talking towards like what can people do to create a cleaner future, not just survive until there is a cleaner future, but to create that cleaner future for themselves, for their children, for their children's children. And that's in all of the conversations that we've had or that I've heard you have with other people here at Wild and Scenic. Hope is what it boils down to, is that if I want you to care about something, I have to give you hope that your actions will improve its outcome. I can't just say, hey, this is bad, because that's not effective, right?
Exactly.
So you've mentioned it a couple of times, and Chance and I have had the opportunity to see you talk about it in some of your other talks, but how has your bipolar disorder and figuring out and like being diagnosed with it later in life, how has that affected how you tackle things in your life and kind of just your day-to-day and how you're managing that? Yeah,
living with bipolar II disorder has been a huge journey for me because I think I used to think I got it in my mid-teens, and I actually think I say that in the film. But looking back more over the last year, I think I've realized I had it most of my life, which is more unusual. It's rare for children to have it, but I believe I did. And so that's what I mentioned, this kind of extreme personality that permeated itself through the outdoors and kind of like wanting to do things to the extreme and kind of eventually becoming an ice climber was like that. And so, you know, my life, I lived with really extreme dysfunction when I was untreated, before I was diagnosed. That life was just hard. And people always ask me, like, how did you not know? And the answer to me is really obvious, which is that I just thought life involved a tremendous amount of suffering. I thought this was the cost of living. And I'd look around at everybody and just think, how are they so much better at enduring this level of suffering than me? Your baseline is so messed up. It's so off.
Which draws so much guilt to yourself of, right, what is my failing that I can't do what other people are doing?
Exactly. Like, you know, it was like these behaviors I had, I look back and I'm like, that was so obviously dysfunctional. But at the time, I didn't think so. Like going to the gym at 2 a.m., not being able to get out of bed for like almost days, or really struggling to get out of bed and then doing it, but kind of suffering throughout the day. You know, going to bed thinking it was like a victory. I somehow got through the day. That, you know, that's not something I experience every night now. All of these things, I would get obsessed with topics that no one else cared about. And it was like all I wanted to talk about. So there's this period I got really into the science of sunblock. Like UVA versus UVB, and what chemicals you need in sunblock for it to be really effective, and which are more effective than others. And it was like all I wanted to talk about.
And my people are like, please stop.
Yeah, exactly. It was like, it's humorous to think about. I'm so grateful for my friends who had so much grace for me. And we're just like, yeah, I guess that's cool, Molly. But like all of those things were such a deep part of bipolar 2 disorder for me and how it manifested itself. And so coming out the other end, I got diagnosed. It was my second day at the White House. Really scary experience, but it's the best thing that ever happened to me. And so getting diagnosed, I then went through this whole journey of treatment and them figuring out the right treatment, which is also really challenging and painful because they have to titrate the medication and you're kind of a guinea pig. And so some days at the White House, it was like I couldn't stop eating because of the side effect of this medication they tried out. And they never knew what it would do for me. And sometimes it would make me shake uncontrollably. I'd have akathisia. And so all of these impacts were so rough. But eventually we found the right treatment for me, which I'm so deeply grateful for. And I think I'm like the luckiest person on earth to be able to have such effective treatment. And in that process, kind of came out the other side, realizing this is incurable and lifelong, my condition. But that's kind of wonderful in some ways, because I realized that there are some kind of ways in which it's blessed my life in ways I wouldn't give up. And so I always say, if like some magical being came into my life and was like, I can take this away from you, I wouldn't do it. Treated, untreated in a second, but treated, I wouldn't. And so I just realized that, you know, I looked around at my life at one point and realized that for all these amazing things, ice climbing, dreams of Alaska, getting to work at the White House, I realized that I had bipolar 2 disorder to thank for them. And so it's been the source of all of my suffering, but it's been truly the fuel of all of my success. And so because of that, you know, it kind of continues to drive you. And then you mentioned, you know, the connection with climate change. That's where there really was this nexus that I never thought I'd find in my life. But when you have a mental illness, you think about your mind all the time because you think it's betraying you. At least for me, that was my experience. And so one thing I started to realize over a period was like, actually, maybe we have to harness the power of the human mind to address climate change. You know, we're fighting climate change in the streets, we're fighting it at desks, we're fighting it in labs, but like we also need to fight it in people's minds. And that was kind of this missing piece I realized one day at the White House when I was at my desk, that to solve the climate crisis, we need systemic change. To get systemic change, we need policy. To get policy, we need the public on board. And the missing piece was, we can't get them on board until they feel something. In that last part, the people need to feel something in order to act. I realized that that was key.
Right.
So when you look at the psychology research, again, which was like very, very intertwined with my world, living with bipolar disorder, I started to realize that the emotions we've been instilling in the public through climate narratives are actually antithetical to action. that we're taking away people's ability to act when we, promote fear, guilt, and shame on climate narratives around things like the climate footprint, around things like how we say we. We started using we in new ways when we said, look what we've done. Look at the problem we've created. We are to blame. Humans are terrible. We're terrible. And that's
cool,
incredibly,
thanks, right?
Yeah, it's incredibly destructive to people's psyche and their well-being when we use that. And not only that, it's ineffective, right? If we need people to act, we should just be looking at the psychology research that's saying this won't make people act. You're taking away their ability to act.
Right.
So that's kind of where this world, my two worlds came together between bipolar disorder and climate.
Yeah. And I think you had a great kind of metaphor, I guess, for how you described it in the coffee chat that we were just at with you, where you said, someone's sitting on their couch, you go in and you're like, hey, we got this big problem, we have climate crisis and there's nothing really we can do about it. You want to help? It's like, no, not really. And you go in and you're like, hey, we have this big problem, but like we can fix it. We can change it. Like, do you want to help? And it's like, yeah, now I'm excited to help. I can make a change, and framing it that way.
Exactly. And that's the power of hope, right? The second frame is using hope as the frame and saying this isn't feasible. There's momentum and there's an endpoint, which is the zero carbon promised land. And we're well on our way. The more we can tell people that we're getting there, jump on board. This is like the best bandwagon you can be a part of. And I love that. Like, yeah, join the bandwagon. It's okay if you haven't been a part of it. Like, we have progress. This is the time. If you're a person who cares about the health and well-being of their children and society, but hasn't acted because you haven't felt that there's a place for you in the climate movement. There's not only a place, we've been waiting for you.
Right. We need you.
We need you.
We want you in this fight with us.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other sort of reframing techniques that we've talked about is the ways in which climate action has historically, or, in the past couple decades, been talked about as individual change, right? Me as an individual, the choices I make on a day-to-day basis are what are going to solve or compound the issue of climate change. And I just want you to go through and tell that story because it'll be so much more powerful coming from you about where this whole idea of individual change beats climate change, or individual action beats climate change, came from, and how it's not actually effective.
Yeah. So I'll preface this with saying, the greening your life thing, anybody who has the time, the energy, the resources, the privilege, the knowledge of being able to green their life, I commend them. Keep doing it.
Right. It's a great thing. It's not a bad thing to do.
No. When we extend into climate guilt and climate shaming, that's where I have beef. That's where I start pushing back and get really pissed off at people. But I'll start by telling you a story, actually, and a lot of people haven't heard it, and it really surprises them. So in the early 2000s, an organization hired a prominent PR firm called Ogilvy Mather, prominent PR firm, and started a huge marketing campaign to promote the idea of the individual carbon footprint. They popularized it. It actually shot up in the literature. And credit to Mark Kaufman, the journalist, who actually has uncovered this story and has a really good piece in Mashable on this. Who was that organization that hired them? It was a fossil fuel company called British Petroleum, or BP, as in BP oil spill. It was those people. So you have to ask yourself, why would a fossil fuel company want you to focus on greening your life? Well, the carbon footprint, and so many people have taken those carbon footprint calculators, it actually teaches you to do workarounds to a system based in fossil fuels, right? When you say ride your bike to work, you're saying avoid our transportation system. When you say turn off your lights at night, you're saying avoid our electricity system. If I turn off my lights at night, I incur kind of this inconvenience to my quality of life. And at the end of the day, what happens to the electricity grid?
Nothing. I mean, that has no functional effect on the amount of electricity used in the city that day.
Exactly. So if people focus on greening their life, they're not focusing on better regulating the oil and gas industry. This is the most effective and deceitful PR campaign in history, I believe.
It's brilliant. Like, from a completely, like, throwing morals out the window, it is an absolutely brilliant technique for them to continue their objective, right? Because it shifts the onus of action onto individuals, regardless of their ability to do so. And the kinds of people that are looking up their carbon footprint and what they can do about it are the kinds of people that, if they didn't have that conversation to have would be looking for other ways to impact the fossil fuel industry, right? It's like, here, play with this inconsequential tool that you think might help while I continue to go do exactly what I'm doing without paying you another mind, right? It self-selects for the kind of people that are going to be interested in climate change and gives them something else to think about while they continue what they're doing. And it's, again, brilliant and horrifying at the same time.
Exactly. And millennials, we were really the generation that was fed this narrative. You know, boomers were really fed climate change doesn't exist. So you have a bunch of deniers, or, you know, actually, they're not a bunch of deniers out there, but the ones that are boomers. Millennials were fed the carbon footprint. They will fall upon the sword before they consider reframing it in other ways to take action. And well, yeah, so I'll end there. But getting at what's happening here is that the carbon footprint calculator, it's a made-up concept. It's a construct. And it takes a system based on fossil fuels, and it's systematically apportioning blame onto the end users who are forced to use it. It blames you for our electricity system, our transportation system, even parts of industry, right? Steel, cement. It's blaming you for our infrastructure.
Right.
And so you have to ask yourself at one point, like, can we really cut that much of our carbon footprint? The answer is no. You have 16 to 17 tons of carbon that they allot you per year in America. Of that, you can't.
I mean, if you could reduce that by 20%, that's a huge shift, and it incurs great personal inconvenience.
Exactly.
And that is still, you know, what, 3 of the 16 or 17 that you're allotted compared to what's the global piece of the pie, right?
Exactly. There's actually a university study that found that a man experiencing homelessness and a Buddhist monk both have still unsustainable carbon footprints because of just the metric, the way they allot it to you. So, you know, there's this argument that people make, which they don't actually look at the numbers for, where they say, well, if I take action, maybe it's not big, but if all of us take action, to some extent, yes, of course. But if you look at actually the climate problem, it's a drop in the bucket. And we don't have time for that. We don't have time for ineffective climate solutions. We only have time for effective ones. We need to solve climate at scale. It is a crisis that needs to be solved structurally. And structure is policy.
Yeah.
Right? And
absolutely.
How do you get policy? You get it through elections. So systemic change is policy, government action, election, and campaigns. That is the answer to how we solve the climate crisis. And so one thing we've been working on is helping people reframe how to take action away from kind of, again, if you can green your life, awesome, keep doing it. Do not engage in climate guilt. That's where I get mad, because this idea of kind of faulting everyday people who are struggling to get by for the fact that they aren't making these changes in their life that they might not be able to afford, not know about, not have time for. Even like doing your laundry after 9 p.m., it's great if you can, but, you know, people working 2 jobs might not have that luxury.
Right.
This is a big problem. So like if a guy is committing himself so much to greening his life, he's sitting in a sad, dark house, is he a climate hero?
I mean,
I don't know.
He's as much a victim in my mind as people that don't have the choice to escape polluted water or polluted air.
Exactly, because exactly like you're getting at across town, if there's a fossil fuel power plant and it's spewing pollution into the air, like is happening in like Richmond, California, for example, you have to ask yourself, what have you done to help them? How are you helping clean up their air? Because the alternative is if you do something like register people to vote, you can help change the outcomes of elections through these things. Actually, way more easily than people realize. And in the process, if you get pro-climate candidates in, they can enact policies that are going to do things like decarbonize our electricity grid, decarbonize our transportation system, and in the process, help clean up the airs for these communities. That has societal change. And that's what we need on climate. We have to be focusing on everybody and structural change that is going to actually solve the climate crisis. And that's what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of in my mind, what we're talking about here is that individual actions for greening your life are awesome. Keep doing them. And as a matter of fact, for me, what that is it's continuing a relationship and keeping the thought in your mind of like, hey, we need to be working on this climate problem. This is something that is important. And, you know, small actions daily remind me that I'm working in a larger fight, but not using despair and guilt, but instead using hope to inspire systemic change, which is governmental action. It's changing policies. It's getting more people out to vote because there's tons of people. I mean, basically everybody cares about living a healthy life for themselves and for their children. And that is climate action, right? That is absolutely, if you care about yourself and your family, you care about policies like, hey, I don't want to drink toxic chemicals in my water. I don't want to be breathing chemicals that cause increased childhood asthma rates, right? So it's just getting out to vote and getting you as a person, getting other people out to vote or to have conversations or to think about these things, right?
Yeah, it is. And there's one organization I really push because I've realized that they are the answer to the climate crisis, which is called the Environmental Voter Project or environmentalvoter.org. So what they do is they use really advanced analytics in order to identify environmentalists who don't vote. I didn't know these people existed. And when I heard about it, I didn't believe them. And they were like, I looked at the data. I'm like, oh my God, all these environmentalists don't vote in states that are determining everything.
Yeah.
So they use behavioral science in order to turn them into lifelong voters through volunteers. It can be as simple as calling somebody and reminding them that today is election day. Do you know that can actually change the outcome of elections?
Yeah, we're from Georgia.
Are you? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and that's actually the other thing I was going to say is you want to believe me on this? Okay, so we got the Inflation Reduction Act a few months ago. This is the biggest climate action in history anywhere in the world. It's going to actually change what the future looks like for our children. They will live in a better world because of this law. And how did we get that? Well, 2 elections ago, there were a bunch of community organizers on the ground in Georgia, largely with Stacey Abrams' organizations, and they registered people to vote at historic rates. And in the process, those new voters helped flip a state that everybody said is never flippable, elected 2 new senators who made that happen. Right? Got that passed. Those were the votes.
And I think it's important to reiterate that the change happened not because we got more voters who were already voting to change their personal beliefs, right? It was that we got people who were not part of the voting equation at all just to show up and cast their vote, which is their right. That's the change.
This is what helped Obama win, right? It's expanding the electorate. And it's also fighting voter suppression and gerrymandered maps. Those are the other aspects of climate action. All the things associated with the Voting Rights Act. All of these things have huge impact. So it's this climate elections nexus. That's what I'm pushing right now because I'm like, this is how we solve climate at scale, truly solve it for our children. That's the answer. That's how we have to reframe.
And it's solvable.
It is solvable.
That's the point that hasn't been part of the narrative for a long time is that there is, what did you call it, a zero carbon promised land?
Yeah.
Right? It's there. And we have the technology, we're 99% of the way there. Its deployment is a change, right? It's getting the systemic change, which is always uncomfortable, but is vitally important and completely doable.
Yeah. You talk to any climate professional, they will tell you we have the solutions. We just need policy to accelerate it. That's what we need. We just need to push faster. And the American people can do that. The American people have that power through elections and advocacy to make that happen because we live in a democracy. It's the beauty of this. So that's how individuals have an impact here, a real impact, right? That's how we're truly empowered. And when you lead with hope, when you believe in that zero carbon promised land, that's the answer. That's how we get there. And we need to make people feel that hope and be aware of that and feel the emotions associated with that, associated with motivation in order to get them to act. And that's the other aspect of this is we can't gatekeep the environmental movement. The climate movement's done a better job of this. We can't tell people these are the prerequisites in order to be an environmentalist. You have to ride your bike to work. A lot of people don't have bikes. A lot of people don't know how to ride a bike. A lot of people don't live in a community with clean enough air where if they ride a bike, they won't get sick. We can't make these things a prerequisite. If you go vegan, you have to have access to the food.
And the money to pay for it.
And people live in food deserts in America. So all of these things can't be prerequisites in order to welcome more people into the climate movement. Right. If you are a human being who cares about anything, you are welcome. There's a place for you. You are a part of this movement. And I think that's something very, very important we need to do is make this accessible and open and focused on everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And we cannot wait to see what you do next. I'm sure you have a very bright and long journey ahead of you. As we wrap up, where can people go to find The Scale of Hope and watch that?
Yeah, the Scale of Hope is available on Patagonia's YouTube channel. So on YouTube for free. It's a 67-minute film, a little too long, I think. I hope people don't get bored of me. But it really does dive into topics beyond just ice climbing. And I think that's one of the things Patagonia was really excited about, is to, really talk about a lot of real things in this film. And so, again, mental health is a big part of this, which is very relevant to people right now, because even if you don't have a, bipolar disorder, you know what it's like to struggle. And that's kind of the point of relation we have through that string of the film. Climate is like an everybody's welcome thing. And climbing is like, you can pursue dreams that you think are impossible, and your dreams can be so much closer and within reach than you realize.
Fantastic. What a place to close this conversation. This truly has been such a delight. Thank you so much for being on the show. If you guys are listening right now and you'd like to go watch The Scale of Hope, or if you'd like to go learn about Environmental Voter Project, or if you'd like to just learn more about Molly, scroll down to the show notes. I've got some links there for you guys to check out. You can go straight from listening to learning more. And once again, Molly, just thank you so much for doing what you do and for being on the show.
Thank you both so much. It's so great to be here with you all.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conservation Connection.
If you enjoyed our podcast, go ahead and subscribe to make sure you catch every episode that we post.
We'd love to hear from you. So if you want to reach out, go to our website, lastchanceendeavors.com/contact, and shoot us an email.
We love questions from our listeners, so if you heard something you'd like to learn more about, be sure to let us know.
If you've got a minute to spare, leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts will help other conservation-minded people find the show. We'd really appreciate it.
A big thanks to the people working to protect our planet, and a big thanks to you for listening. Don't forget to tune in next time.